Welcome to Mental Health Matters, a podcast of KU Leuven Healthy. With this podcast, we will share inspiring stories to keep young researchers in a good mental shape. I'm Pieter-Jan, PJ, and this is Robin.
Hello.
We are both two young researchers at the KU Leuven and we will host this podcast.
In each episode, we will talk with a Ph.D. student or a postdoc of the KU Leuven about their health and well-being. Through the different episodes, we will try to find answers on different questions like how do you stay confident and resilient in a highly competitive world?
How do you deal with stress, isolation or anxiety?
How do you create a good work-life balance?
And how do you stay motivated during your research process? Find out the answers together with us and get inspired. Discover the advice of different experts of KU Leuven on the broad range of topics. And at the end of each episode, Robin and I try out an exercise or some advice under guidance of our guests.
So let's discover new habits to stay healthy and in a good mental shape. Hi PJ.
Hi Robin, welcome back.
Today we are going to meet Lars, who is a postdoc at the KU Leuven, and during his career path he has traveled a lot of countries, which led to isolation and feelings of loneliness. Hi Lars, it's nice to have you here. Every podcast we start with a few dilemma questions, just to get to know our guest a little bit more. Are you a cat or a dog person?
I'm a dog person, but don't tell my cat that.
Okay, I was wondering because you have a cat, right?
Yeah, and he's very sweet, although he woke me up at 4 a.m. today. But I am more of a dog person, but I live in cities, so that's very difficult. Love him to bits, but prefer dogs.
What do you prefer, an evening of video games or a night out with friends?
A night out with friends. I did my Ph.D. about video games, and turns out that if you spend like 6 years researching something, it becomes less of like a hobby.
That's
so
interesting,
definitely
yeah.
A night out. Yeah.
What do you do on the night out?
That'll have to be dancing.
Would you choose Brussels, Antwerp, or Melbourne?
I've been thinking about this a lot in my life. Would I go back to Melbourne, which is the most beautiful city for food and coffee in the world? But I think I prefer Brussels. It's small enough, but it's also a very international city. So after Toronto, it's the most international city in the world in terms of how many people live there that aren't from the country around it. It's smelly, it's chaotic, which I think are important traits for a city.
Hi Lars, nice to meet you as well. I was just wondering, who are you? What do you do in life? What's your research about? Can you tell us a little bit more about the guy with the mustache behind the mic here?
I'm Lars. I'm a guy with a mustache from the Netherlands. I moved to Belgium 7.5 years ago to do PhD research on video games because I'm kind of interested in general how the ways in which we see the world and the media we use mutually construct each other. I'm glad I finished that PhD because now my research is on conspiracy theories. So I lived in Leuven for a year and then I moved to Antwerp. And then I went to Melbourne for a bit. I came back to Brussels, and then I went to Montreal, and then I came back to Brussels again. And then I went to Finland, and then I came back to Brussels again.
You always have to start a little bit over or start with a new area you're not familiar with?
Yeah, I want to say it's lovely, but it is actually quite tiring to return to a new place again and kind of like, find your way around. It's exciting for the first month, and then you kind of start missing your friends and things like that. But on the other hand, you have this kind of similar academic community wherever you go. If you visit a university, you end up hanging out with the same kind of person. Very international, social scientists. So that usually works. That makes things easier.
Okay, and now you say you have this sort of community. Do you always have the feeling that they were very welcoming? Was it easy to come into this community if you went to another country, or was it somewhat hard?
Well, I mean, it's funny to notice kind of the cultural differences of how people welcome you and to what extent they do. I found Australians very easygoing and very welcoming, whereas Finnish people took a while longer to, do things like speak or emote.
I can imagine the welcoming part can be at work, but then here in Belgium, most of us end at 5 p.m. And then there's another whole life besides the work-related stuff. How do you feel how do you deal with that? Build a network that's not work-related.
I noticed in Belgium when I arrived, and of course Dutch people have this very nice idea of Belgians being a lot of fun and they like good food and like good beer, whereas we only drink Heineken and we're just very loud. So I expected maybe a little bit more of a social interaction. But then if you work in Leuven, and you're above, say, 24, you probably don't live in Leuven as much. So I noticed that a lot of my colleagues, would go home to their town where they have their friends and probably a partner for a long time. And so I was stuck in Leuven as like an empty city. And actually, I didn't find a solution to that besides moving. So I moved. And then in Antwerp, I had kind of like a similar experience. And only in Melbourne and then Brussels did I find out that, at least to me, the solution is to just find other alienated expats, basically. And it sounds weird saying this as a Dutch person, because you'd kind of think that Belgian and Dutch culture are similar. You speak the same language. I would even go as far as to say that Australian culture is more similar to Dutch culture than Belgian. I really felt like not an Englishman in New York, but like an American in Oxford or something. I felt so rude and loud. I was like, ugh.
You said that in Brussels you found your group. How do you search for them? Do you go online on experts living in Brussels kind of stuff, or do you go for your social hobby or social activities like a hobby and find new people there?
Yeah, so you meet people at hobbies like language classes, for instance. I'm learning Mandarin now, meeting some people from that. You go to places to drink and dance, and you kind of like just end up talking to people. And a big one is Tinder, right? So a lot of my friends are people that I've dated at some point.
How did you deal with that? Because if you were isolated and it took you 7 years to build this network, how did you cope with these feelings at first?
I mean, I had the luxury of living very close to my own country, right? So on weekends, I would just go to The Hague or Leiden very often and kind of see my friends there, which still means that for 5 days of the week, you're more or less by yourself. Which is great for reading books, but not so much for, feeling connected and having some kind of, grounding in both the society you live in, as well as, checking up with other people, like, how are we doing? How's not just our work, but our mental health.
We often have a lot of international new colleagues. What would you advise for us to make it more welcoming for them, for example?
That's a very good question, because we've talked about that a lot in different committees and things where I've been a doctoral representative. And the answer that people want to propose all the time is, we should maybe do more kind of like research symposia or places where PhD students can get together and kind of share what they're doing. But all of that is still work related, and I don't think that helps. I think people should just get together and have a bunch of drinks. It sounds really straightforward, but I think it's exactly that. It's the tried and true Western method of getting people to relate to each other more easily.
Do you have some other advice than drinking for maybe supervisors or the ones who can organize stuff? Or would you say it has to come bottom up? It's the PhDs and the postdocs who have to create events and...
Yeah, that's the main advice besides drinking. It's not about the drinking, even though I think Triple Carmelite has done more for PhD students than any doctoral seminar ever will. It's in the end about having a space where people can informally talk, preferably without supervisors, where they realize like, hey, it's actually pretty normal. It's not my fault. It's not my supervisor's fault. It's just that this job is really stressful, and I'm not the imposter here. I'm not the only one who feels absolutely drained after, talking to their supervisor for 2 hours or even an hour about their thesis. And that it's normal to just want to go home, and actually to do that, to go home. And you can only realize that after, I think, sharing those experiences in what people sometimes call a safe space, right?
Yeah, I think it's very relatable, because if you have these symposia, which are normally organized for PhD, you constantly have the feeling like, oh, I still have to do something or present or be attentive for the research part. But we also, for example, often do some Friday drinks, and there often you have these conversations like, oh, you have this too, or I didn't know you felt this way. And that helped so much more than these like more formal things, because then, yeah, of course, these are not exactly the places you would talk about these uncertain feelings or these imposter feelings like you mentioned. So I think it's very relatable that you say you need to have these informal activities organized from PhDs themselves, or just like, hey, let's have a drink after work, maybe a coffee.
And then, of course, you mentioned Friday drinks again. But to come back to the question, is there anything else than alcohol to do that with? And so my colleague and I, we have regular Fridays. So we just eat fries and we talk about our problems.
Fridays.
Yep.
That's a good one.
Proper Friday, yeah.
Getting an ice cream on a hot day doesn't have to be drinks necessarily, but it can be just like an informal setup, maybe just a walk. Have you had the feeling that this also has benefited for you, these informal conversations?
Absolutely, because I thought I was crazy. I thought I was the only one who didn't do things easily. I also, at that point, my supervisor had only one PhD student, me. And so I couldn't directly relate to any similar experiences. Other groups and other people just had things figured out better. Turns out that's not true. Everyone is a mess, but they're presenting really well like they're not. And that's good. That's good to find out that everyone is pretending to know what they're doing. I think the problem with a PhD, with doing a PhD or a postdoc or any kind of research, is you can never really walk away from a day of work thinking, well, I finished everything I had to do. Or even a month, you have these like year-long projects and everything goes really slowly. But what I have learned from friends of mine in the department is that you celebrate submissions, for instance. So you might submit something 3 times before it gets accepted, but instead of waiting until it gets accepted to celebrate that, just celebrate submitting something. And if you celebrate every time any of your colleagues submit anything, you end up actually having a lot of nice moments where you do compliment each other on a job well done of submitting.
It's often these things you forget to celebrate, so it's very important that we also celebrate these little things, because otherwise it's a long project to only celebrate the major milestones.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's very nice that you do that in your department, to celebrate each submission, or like you say, then you have a lot of celebrations.
It's very easy to just also talk about the parts that need improvement of whatever you've written, because if you have 1 hour to talk to either your peers or your supervisor about what you've done, then, they want to cram everything you can improve in the paper into that 1 hour you have, because that is the efficient way to work, right? So you end up forgetting really easily to just say, hey, that's a really good idea you're working on. It needs improvement, and let's talk about this, but that's really good. And very often it is, like, all of your colleagues are very motivated, very smart people, and they tend to forget that.
That's a great suggestion, actually, because also when you're giving feedback, I try to also don't forget to say something positive about it, because you're just focused on, okay, what can be better? How can I improve this? And you forget sometimes to say, oh, this paragraph is just perfectly written. I can completely follow you. I also try to do that with my master thesis students. Not always easy, but it's good to have that reminder that positive feedback is so important as well, on even small things. We also have interviewed some experts. Today we're going to listen to Professor Philip Boon from the KU Leuven, who has something to say about the importance of the social aspects.
Many people realize how important social support is for their well-being, but they usually only think in terms of support by individuals close to them. However, the social cure approach argues that we underestimate the importance of the social support that is offered by more abstract groups to which we belong. These can be professional or leisure time groups, societal categories, or even roles. For example, you might be a psychologist, be a member of a local gym, and a parent of 2. These labels can be seen as groups. Even though we might not experience strong individual connections with people within the same groups and categories, these shared social identities are a potential source of resilience against different stresses, if positively evaluated. It is therefore essential to occasionally reflect on how the different groups we belong to contribute to our well-being. This allows us to consider whether we have enough positive group memberships, and if not, to seek out new or more matching groups.
What did you think about the social cure approach?
Yeah, I think it's easier to fall back on being a more, let's say, complex self instead of, identifying yourself completely with just your work, which I think is very easy to do, considering how absorbing your academic identity can be as a researcher, right? People end up working on Saturdays very often. You have all these different tasks, whether you're a lecturer or a researcher, an interviewer, and you can get absorbed in it really easily. Whereas that also means that a rejection for a paper, for instance, might hit really hard. Whereas if you're also, a friend to people that hopefully aren't in academia, you might also be someone who learns a language, who has a hobby, someone who likes dancing, someone, who plays sports maybe even.
Do you have like a particular other identity you would give yourself besides being a researcher then?
I like to be politically involved. So, I'd call myself, a large part of myself, a Marxist. But I'm also just like a super basic person who literally goes to Basic Fit.
So you do some sports?
I do actually, yeah. I don't want to identify myself with that. Maybe that's why the social cure approach is slightly awkward. Like, ooh, am I a person who does sports? Nah, that's just the thing I do. But yeah, I do.
But I think it's interesting that you say you need this other type of identity to not be caught up in one identity, like being a researcher. And if something bad happens, it's going to struck hard because you only have this identity. For me, example, it's the identity. I'm a basketball player, and this really distinguishes me from being at work, and then after work I go to this other identity where I don't think about work at all. And if I wouldn't have this identity, I think it would be hard to completely let it go, the work or the stress you have from work sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. Which is also why I like taking a train from work. Because when I'm in Leuven, I work. When I'm in Saint-Gilles or Brussels, I don't. And when on Sundays, I just thought of like a different part of myself, basically. I do, since this season, proper glory hunter, go to games by Union Saint-Gilloise.
And it's every Sunday that you do that, or?
I only go to home games. And there are, I have to admit, some colleagues going there as well. And some other friends. But that's a lot of fun because you get to just like be hyper masculine and kind of like yell, and everything is for that moment about that game. And I was never a football fan before that, but I now realize how nice it is to like be completely divorced from your intellectual milieu or whatever.
I was also wondering, because we talked a lot about how finding like-minded people to share experiences, informal conversations is very necessary. Are you also a person who gives this for other people, or how do you try to help other people in this?
We try to make this like a network of kind of mutual care. So just a couple of days ago, a colleague called me at 10 p.m., really distressed because of some comments by a supervisor when they had wanted to submit basically a year ago already. And it's just part of being both colleagues and friends, that vague space where you're kind of both, where you provide care for each other. And I would call this person in a heartbeat as well if I had a similar problem. So this also makes some friendships or networks maybe in a different way tiring, because it is a form of emotional labor that, yes, you do because you care for each other. But it does get very tiring to help each other.
Been an interesting talk about how you progressed into finding out your social identities and finding new groups. But it wasn't that easy, I can imagine. At which point did you need more professional help?
Yeah, so at some point I realized that you can form groups with people, but if it's a network of care where you just end up tiring each other out by performing emotional labor and calling each other when you're in distress, I very much advocate for just everyone going to therapy for that reason, because then you can pay someone to listen to your little problems and you don't have to feel guilty.
What do you talk about then, if you want to share that with us?
I think a lot of discourse around therapy lately has normalized it anyway, right? So if you look at like Twitter or the way people just talk on TikTok or whatever, everyone should go to therapy. And that for me was such a big realization. Like, I don't have to wait for my burnout. Let's just try it now. And luckily, KU Leuven has therapy sessions, more or less. PhD students can do that once. That was really helpful for me to just go there. I was kind of curious in general and just, tell this person that like, yeah, so my job's stressful. I don't have any problems right now. I feel like maybe I shouldn't be here, but at least I'm stressed and I'd like to talk to someone about my little bourgeois problems. And hearing back from a professional, a therapist, that actually most of their clients do that, and that it's actually very normal to just come there. And I now do this with my therapist. I see her every week, and I kind of just go, oh, this week was so stressful. I haven't thought of anything to talk to you about. I don't have any deep problems going on right now, but God, I'm so tired. And then she just asks you like, hey, so how do you feel? How was your week? So it's actually very mundane, but that really helps.
I think it's very interesting that you say that, like, it's not necessarily these very big problems like the burnout or are already at the stage of having these big problems, but it's good that you go to the therapy with small problems even, because then it doesn't have to change into big problems. And I think that's often like the barrier for people, that they think like, oh, but this problem is not big enough, or maybe I'm making this bigger for myself than it actually is. So I am not the one who can go to therapy, or I am not in this place to go.
You feel so privileged because you get to like do a PhD. Not a lot of people are, allowed to do that, let's say. And you have all this freedom, and maybe some of your friends might think that you're not really working. You're just playing video games all day because you're researching media, right? And so it feels like you should be really happy with that job. But at the same time, and I don't want to say that Belgium is similar to the United States. Of course, it's a different situation. But PhD students in the US report higher amounts of stress than people who work at the police or the fire department. And, even in Belgium, based on surveys, I think PhD students in research from a few years ago in Ghent reported that they suffered significantly more often from common mental health issues like lack of sleep, stress, even burnout, depression, suicidal ideation, things like that. And I think the point of normalizing therapy is that you talk to someone before you reach a burnout, before you end up not being able to get out of bed. We have these stories. A lot of people at KU Leuven, which is a university that offers a lot of support, drop out. And I think going to therapy before that happens might benefit us all.
At the end of every podcast, we actually try out an exercise, or we listen to some advice of our speaker. And we think it's interesting to do this because this advice might even help ourselves and the listeners of the podcast, of course.
And so since you mentioned therapy, I was just wondering if you could talk us through how it looks like.
Well, I mean, it's very easy, Peter. How are you feeling right now?
Ça va. And there is indeed some awkwardness right now, and some, I feel I need to protect my inner self and not expose how I am actually feeling. So that's a very interesting question to start with.
Yeah, I said it's easy, but it's actually one of the most difficult questions I've ever had in my life.
Indeed.
And that's even including my PhD defense. It's like, how do you feel? I don't know.
How do you progress in being capable to answer that question?
I mean, to me, it's a lot like learning how to taste wine. The wine is there and it's touching your mouth, and you taste exactly the same whether you know how to describe it or not. But then when someone gives you a vocabulary, like, hey, some wines can have like leathery notes, or they can taste like forest ground a little bit, or, just the difference between feeling alienated, isolated, lonely, or anxious, or nervous, all these kind of nuances. You learn how to describe and get in touch with your own emotions in the same way that you learn how to taste wine, or probably a lot of things, as long as people offer you a vocabulary and a space to explore those, which I think for men in particular is very difficult, or people who see themselves as intellectuals, like we don't feel things, we think things, right? But to learn how to do that and to have someone confront you with maybe your inability to do that is very challenging.
Do you maybe have one final recommendation for our listeners then?
Yes, go to therapy. Just try it. We have a lot of resources at KU Leuven. There's a lot of clinical psychologists waiting outside of that, and it's worth a try.
Thank you so much, Lars, for sharing your story with us.
Hopefully we'll meet in some informal PhD network once again.
Cool. Let's have drinks.
Fries.
Thank you for listening to Mental Health Matters. We hope you got inspired by these stories on how to keep young researchers in a good mental shape.
Our guest in the final episode is Michalina. She will talk to us about the importance of gratitude and mindful living.
If you want to know more about these topics and KU Leuven Healthy, visit kuleuven.be/healthy. This podcast is brought to you by KU Leuven Healthy and produced by Chase Creative.